Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever heard a voice that wasn't there? A whisper carried on salt-laden winds, calling your name when no living soul stands nearby? The sea was unusually calm that evening as I made my way along the rocky shoreline of Harper's Cove. The locals had warned me against visiting the abandoned Black Rock Lighthouse after sunset, but I dismissed their concerns as nothing more than small-town superstition. As a maritime historian documenting decommissioned navigational structures along the Maine coast, I'd visited dozens of lighthouses. What made this one any different? My rental car struggled against the narrow, overgrown path that wound toward the promontory. The lighthouse stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its once proud tower now weathered and forgotten. According to my research, the Black Rock Lighthouse had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century before being decommissioned 15 years ago, a victim of budget cuts and modern GPS technology. I parked and gathered my equipment, camera, notebook, flashlight, and a thermos of coffee. The October air carried a bitter chill, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I approached the structure. The lighthouse keeper's cottage sat adjacent to the tower, its windows boarded and roof partially collapsed from years of neglect. A strange melancholy settled over me as I circled the building, photographing the architectural details. Something about abandoned places always stirred an inexplicable sadness within me. Perhaps it was the lingering echo of purpose unfulfilled. The metal door to the tower was secured with a rusted padlock, but I obtained permission from the coastal authority to access the structure. The key turned with difficulty, the lock's internal mechanisms groaning in protest after years of disuse. The door swung open with a mournful creak that seemed to amplify in the stillness of the evening. A musty odor greeted me, the unmistakable scent of dampness, decay, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something acrid and metallic? Hello? I called into the darkness, my voice echoing up the spiral staircase. I didn't expect an answer. I was being ridiculous. Yet somehow, the silence that followed felt deliberate, as if the lighthouse were holding its breath. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and cobweb-draped corners. The spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into shadows above. As I took my first step onto the metal stairs, a distinct tapping sound echoed from somewhere above, like knuckles against glass. I froze, listening intently. The sound didn't repeat, and I convinced myself it was just the structure settling or perhaps debris blown against the lantern room windows. Just the wind, I murmured, my voice unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. The stairs protested beneath my weight as I began my ascent, each metallic groan sending vibrations through the narrow tower. Halfway up, a cold draft washed over me, carrying with it the distinct scent of kerosene. I paused, confused. The lighthouse had been converted to electricity in the 1950s, long before its decommissioning. There should be no reason for the smell of lamp oil. My research hadn't mentioned any recent visitors or maintenance work. According to official records, no one had set foot in Black Rock Lighthouse for at least 3 years. As I continued upward, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath formed visible clouds in the beam of my flashlight. October in Maine was certainly cold, but this felt unnatural, a penetrating chill that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. The tapping sound returned, more insistent now. Tap, tap, tap. Rhythmic. Deliberate. like a signal. Is someone there? I called out, hating how my voice wavered. The tapping stopped abruptly. I reached the landing below the lantern room where the keeper would have prepared the light each evening. Ancient logbooks sat open on a dust-covered desk, the last entry dated 15 years ago, light extinguished for final time at 23:46. End of watch. Something about those words sent a shiver down my spine. I ran my fingers over the faded ink, imagining the keeper writing those words, knowing they marked the end of an era. The final ascent to the lantern room required navigating a narrower set of stairs. As I climbed, the beam of my flashlight caught something unexpected. The glass panes of the lantern room were dark. A faint, amber glow emanated from above. My heart quickened. The lighthouse had been disconnected from the power grid years ago. There should be no light. As I reached the top step, the lantern room came into view. The massive Fresnel lens stood at its center, and within it, impossibly, the faintest flicker of flame danced behind the glass. I stood transfixed, trying to process what I was seeing. The flame cast elongated shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source, stretching and contracting along the curved walls like living things. A sudden gust of wind buffeted the tower, and the metal structure groaned in protest. The flame in the lens wavered but didn't extinguish. And then I saw him, a figure standing on the outer gallery, his back to me, staring out at the darkened sea. The man wore the uniform of a lighthouse keeper from another era, his shoulders hunched as if bearing a great weight. I opened my mouth to call out, but the words died in my throat as the figure slowly turned. Where his face should have been, there was only darkness, a void deeper than the night sky beyond. The room temperature plummeted, and the flame within the lens flared suddenly, illuminating the lantern room with blinding intensity. The logbook's final entry flashed in my mind, end of watch. But what if, for some, the watch never ends? The faceless keeper raised his hand, pointing not at me, but past me, down the spiral staircase from which I ascended. A warning? An invitation? The tapping resumed, louder than before, not from the figure before me, but from somewhere below. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause. Tap, tap, tap. Someone, or something, was coming up the stairs. I backed away from the faceless keeper, my shoulder blades pressing against the cold glass of the lantern room. The tapping from the stairwell grew louder, more insistent, a metallic rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my racing heartbeat. Who's there? I called out, my voice thin and reedy in the charged air. The keeper remained motionless, his hollow face directed toward me. Though he had no eyes, I felt the weight of his gaze. The flame within the Fresnel lens pulsed in time with the tapping, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made the shadows dance and writhe across the curved walls. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Sleep deprivation. Carbon monoxide from some forgotten source. Perhaps local teenagers playing an elaborate prank on the out-of-town historian. Yet deep down, I knew better. There was an ancient weight to this place, a palpable sense of accumulated time and tragedy that no rational explanation could dispel. The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expected, as if the lighthouse itself were holding its breath. I inched toward the stairwell, my flashlight beam trembling across the metal steps. Something dark and viscous dripped from one of the higher steps, landing with an audible plop on the stair below. It glistened in my flashlight beam, too thick to be water, too dark to be anything I wanted to identify. A cold sweat broke across my forehead as I took the first step downward. The metal groaned beneath my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Behind me, I heard movement, the soft scrape of boots on the lantern room floor. I didn't dare look back. My descent was painfully slow, each step deliberate. I kept my flashlight trained on the stairs, trying to ignore the increasing frequency of dark droplets that stained the metal. The smell of kerosene grew stronger, mingling with the unmistakable copper scent of blood. Halfway down, my flashlight beam caught something on the wall, crude markings etched into the peeling paint. Tallies, hundreds of them, grouped in sets of 5. Days? Weeks? Years? Next to them, scratched with desperate intensity, the light must never go out. The words repeated, overlapping one another in different handwritings. Some were small and meticulous, others large and frantic, as if carved in a state of panic or madness. A sudden bang from above made me jump, the lantern room door slamming shut. The amber glow from the mysterious flame no longer filtered down the stairwell, plunging me into darkness broken only by my flashlight beam. I quickened my pace, nearly slipping on the increasingly wet steps. The droplets had become a steady trickle, running down the center of the spiral staircase like a macabre guide. 3/4 of the way down, my flashlight began to flicker. I smacked it against my palm, a gesture of futile desperation. The beam stabilized momentarily, then dimmed to a feeble glow. "No, no, no," I whispered, jiggling the batteries. That's when I heard it, breathing. Not my own panicked gasps, but something deeper, labored, coming from somewhere below. Each exhale carried a faint, mournful whistle, like wind through a cracked window. I froze, straining my eyes to penetrate the gloom ahead. My weakening flashlight revealed nothing but more steps disappearing into darkness. The breathing grew louder. Closer. I had a choice: continue down toward the unseen source of that terrible sound or retreat to the lantern room where the faceless keeper awaited. Neither option promised safety. A sudden draft extinguished the flame within my flashlight, plunging me into absolute darkness. I clutched the central column of the spiral staircase, the metal cold and slick beneath my fingers. In the darkness, other senses heightened. The breathing below had stopped. The dripping continued, now accompanied by a soft, wet sound, like something heavy being dragged across the steps. I fumbled for my phone, activating its feeble light. The blue-white glow illuminated only a foot or two ahead, but it was better than nothing. I resumed my descent, moving sideways, my back pressed against the outer wall. 5 steps later, my foot landed in something warm and viscous. I bit back a cry of disgust, focusing instead on the exit that must be waiting below. Just a few more steps. Just a few more. My phone's light caught a reflection, the metal door at the base of the tower. Freedom. Safety. I nearly sobbed with relief, taking the last few steps in a controlled slide rather than calculated steps. My hand closed around the door handle, ice cold against my palm. I pulled. The door didn't budge. I pulled harder, throwing my weight backward. The handle creaked but held fast. "No, please," I whispered, rattling the handle with increasing desperation. "Please open." From directly behind me came the sound of something heavy and wet landing on the bottom step. My phone's light flickered, then stabilized, revealing a dark puddle spreading across the floor, flowing from beneath the door I was trying so desperately to open. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned. The beam caught a figure huddled on the bottom step, a man in modern clothes, his body contorted unnaturally. Where his neck should have been, there was only a ragged stump, dark liquid pulsing weakly from severed arteries. Despite this impossibility, the figure raised its head, or rather, the absence where its head should have been, toward me. Its hands clutched a logbook identical to the one I'd seen upstairs, pages dark and with the same substance that pulled around its feet. The logbook fell open, pages fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. Words formed in dark liquid across the blank pages. The light must never go out. I screamed then, a primal sound that tore at my throat. I threw myself against the door, no longer caring about injury, driven by blind panic. The door gave way suddenly, sending me sprawling onto the rocky ground outside. Cool night air washed over me, sweet and clean after the oppressive atmosphere within. I scrambled to my feet, expecting pursuit, but the doorway remained empty. No headless figure. No faceless keeper. Only darkness. The lighthouse stood silent against the night sky, its dark tower revealing nothing of what transpired within. Had I imagined it all? Then, as if in answer, a faint amber glow appeared in the lantern room. It pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. A signal. A warning. A plea. I backed away, unable to tear my gaze from that impossible light until I reached my car. As I fumbled with the keys, a movement at the lantern room caught my eye. A figure stood silhouetted against the glass, not the faceless keeper, but a different shape. Smaller. Watching me. The amber light grew brighter, illuminating the watcher's features for just an instant. My own face stared back at me from the tower's height, eyes hollow and mouth open in a silent scream. The light went out. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Despite the horror I'd witnessed or hallucinated, I spent the night in my car, parked at a safe distance from the lighthouse but close enough to maintain visual contact. I told myself it was professional curiosity, but deeper down, I knew it was something else, a compulsion, a tether I couldn't sever. No light appeared in the lantern room for the remainder of the night. The structure stood dark and lifeless against the star-strewn sky, betraying nothing of what I'd experienced within. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, casting long shadows across the rocky shore, I found myself questioning my own perceptions. Had exhaustion and isolation conjured those impossible visions? Perhaps the locals' warnings had seeded my imagination, causing me to manifest their superstitions. Yet the memory of that faceless keeper remained vivid, too detailed, too visceral to dismiss as mere fantasy. With daylight restoring some measure of courage, I decided to return. Not to the lighthouse itself, I wasn't that brave or foolish, but to the village. I needed context, historical records that might explain the phenomena I'd witnessed. The Harper's Cove Historical Society occupied a modest building on the town's main street, its windows overlooking the harbor where fishing vessels bobbed gently in the morning tide. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and furniture polish. An elderly woman looked up from her desk as I entered, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun. Reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, magnifying pale blue eyes that regarded me with immediate suspicion. "You're the one asking about Blackrock," she said. Not a question, but an accusation. Word traveled fast in small coastal communities. I nodded, approaching her desk with what I hoped was a disarming smile. "I'm researching decommissioned lighthouses along the Maine coast," I explained. "I visited Black Rock yesterday, but I'm hoping to fill in some historical details." The woman, Eleanor Thorne, according to the nameplate on her desk, removed her glasses, letting them hang from a chain around her neck. "Most folks who go up there don't come back for a second visit," she observed. "Something changed your mind about our local ghost stories?" I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "I noticed some unusual features. The logbooks mentioned an end of watch, but it felt unfinished somehow. Eleanor studied me for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. Finally, she sighed and stood. "Wait here," she instructed, disappearing into a back room. She returned minutes later carrying a leather-bound volume and a manila folder. "These aren't officially part of our collection," she explained, placing them on the desk between us. "The Coast Guard removed most records when they decommissioned Blackrock. These are personal accounts, local history that never made it into official reports." I opened the folder first. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten letters, and photographs spanning decades. The earliest dated back to 1873, the year Blackrock Lighthouse was first illuminated. Blackrock had more keeper changes than any lighthouse on the eastern seaboard, Eleanor explained as I examined the documents. Most stations, a keeper would stay on for decades. At Blackrock, the longest tenure was 3 years. Most lasted less than 1. A pattern emerged as I sorted through the clippings. Keepers resigned citing health concerns. 2 were committed to asylums. Several simply disappeared, their absences noted only when supply boats found the lighthouse untended. "What happened to them?" I asked, looking up from a particularly disturbing account of a keeper found wandering the rocks below the lighthouse, his clothes soaked with kerosene, muttering about keeping the light burning. Eleanor's expression darkened. The official explanation was isolation-induced psychosis. Lighthouse keeping is a solitary profession, and Blackrock is particularly remote. But you don't believe that. "I believe Blackrock chooses its keepers," she said simply. "And it doesn't let them go easily." She pushed the leather volume toward me. This was discovered during the decommissioning. It had been sealed inside the lighthouse wall, plastered over sometime in the 1920s, according to the restoration team. The journal was bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting inside varied from page to page, dozens of different scripts flowing into one another as if the journal had passed from hand to hand over generations. Unlike the official logbooks I'd seen, with their methodical recordings of weather conditions and ship sightings, this journal contained personal observations, increasingly disturbed in nature. The light speaks to me now. Not in words, but I understand its needs. Found Mitchell's body today. The fall from the gallery shouldn't have taken his head clean off. Something else happened up there. The light must never go out. He waits in the darkness beyond the shore. The light holds him back. I looked up, a chill running through me despite the warmth of the small office. "Who is he?" Eleanor shook her head. "The original keeper, Thomas Blackmore. The lighthouse bears his name, or at least a corruption of it." She pulled a faded daguerreotype from the folder. A stern-faced man in a keeper's uniform stood before the newly constructed lighthouse, his expression severe beneath a full beard. Despite the photographic limitations of the era, his eyes seemed to pierce through time, intense, almost feverish. "Blackmore was dedicated," Eleanor continued. "When they built the lighthouse, shipping losses along this coast had been catastrophic. Hundreds of souls lost to the rocks over the decades. Blackmore took his responsibility personally, too personally, according to accounts from that time." "What happened to him?" "Officially, he died of natural causes after serving 20 years. The longest tenure by far." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "Unofficially, the assistant keeper's journal suggests otherwise. Blackmore refused to leave his post, even as his health deteriorated. In his final days, he supposedly made some kind of pact." "A pact?" I echoed. to remain at his post eternally, to keep the light burning no matter what. Her voice lowered. They found him in the lantern room, his hands fused to the brass railing around the lens, as if he held on so tightly for so long that man and machine had become one. I thought of the faceless figure I'd seen, and the cold certainty settled in my gut that I'd been in the presence of Thomas Blackmore, or whatever remained of him. The stories say he's still there, Eleanor continued. That he chose the keepers who followed, men and women who would understand his devotion. That he marked them somehow. My hand unconsciously rose to my chest, where an inexplicable burning sensation had begun to spread. When the Coast Guard automated the lighthouse in 1968, the light became electric, Eleanor said. The keepers were gone, but locals reported seeing the old kerosene light burning on nights when no electricity flowed to the structure. And when they decommissioned it entirely? I asked, already suspecting the answer. The light never truly went out, Eleanor said softly. Not for those chosen to see it. I closed the journal, my fingers trembling slightly. Thank you for sharing this with me. It's invaluable for my research. Eleanor nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on my face, studying me with growing concern. You saw something up there, didn't you? Something chose you. The burning in my chest intensified. I don't know what you mean. The mark, she whispered. He's given you the mark. I stood abruptly, eager to escape her penetrating gaze. I should go. I have a deadline to meet. Eleanor didn't try to stop me, but as I reached the door, she called out, when you go back, and you will go back, remember why the light exists. It's not just to guide ships to safety. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. What else does it do? It keeps something away, she replied. Something that hungers for the souls lost at sea. Something that has waited centuries for the light to go out. I left without responding, stepping into the bright morning sunlight that suddenly seemed too thin, too weak to dispel the shadows that had taken root in my mind. In my car, I unbuttoned my shirt with shaking fingers. There on my chest, directly over my heart, was a mark I'd never seen before, a perfect circle surrounding a single vertical line. The ancient symbol for a lighthouse. And it was burning. I spent the day in a fog of dread and compulsion, driving aimlessly along coastal roads as the mark on my chest pulsed in time with the distant crashing of waves. Every rational impulse urged me to flee, to drive inland, away from this haunted shore and the lighthouse that now seemed to occupy my thoughts with increasing intensity. Yet something held me in orbit around Blackrock, like a satellite trapped in the gravity well of a dead star. By late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered on the horizon, transforming the previously calm sea into a churning cauldron of gray-green fury. Locals hurried to secure boats and shutters, exchanging worried glances as the barometric pressure plummeted. The radio warned of an unexpected nor'easter, the worst in 20 years, according to the weathered fishermen who gathered at the harbor. I found myself parked at a scenic overlook, watching lightning illuminate the distant silhouette of Blackrock Lighthouse. With each flash, the mark on my chest flared in sympathetic resonance, sending waves of heat through my trembling body. My phone chimed, a weather alert warning residents to seek shelter immediately. Winds exceeding 60 miles per hour were expected within the hour, with destructive coastal flooding to follow. As the first fat raindrops splattered against my windshield, I made a decision that defied all logic. I would return to Blackrock. Not out of curiosity this time, but necessity. The compulsion had transformed into certainty. I needed to be in that lighthouse when the storm hit its peak. The mark demanded it. The road to the lighthouse had deteriorated further in the strengthening storm, washouts, and fallen branches, creating an obstacle course that slowed my progress to a crawl. By the time I reached the promontory, daylight had surrendered to premature darkness, the setting sun completely obscured by roiling storm clouds. I parked as close to the lighthouse as I dared, the wind nearly tearing the car door from its hinges when I emerged. Rain lashed horizontally, stinging my exposed skin like tiny needles. I hunched against the gale, each step toward the lighthouse requiring deliberate effort. The structure loomed before me, dark and lifeless, yet somehow expectant. Waiting. The metal door hung partially open, swinging rhythmically in the gusting wind. Tap, tap, tap against the frame. An invitation. A welcome. A summons. Inside, the relative quiet came as a physical shock after the howling chaos outside. The door closed behind me with a decisive clang, muffling the storm to a distant roar. Water dripped from my sodden clothes onto the stone floor, forming small puddles that reflected my flashlight beam in broken fragments. I stood motionless, listening. No ghostly breathing. No wet, dragging sounds. Just the faint creaking of the tower as it weathered the external assault. The mark on my chest pulsed with increasing urgency, up, 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 directing me toward the lantern room as surely as any spoken command. The spiral staircase bore no evidence of the horrors I'd witnessed on my previous visit. No dark liquid. No tallies scratched into the walls. Just weathered metal and flaking paint, mundane in their decay. Had I imagined it all? Or had the lighthouse somehow reset itself, preparing for whatever ritual the approaching storm would trigger? I ascended steadily, one hand trailing along the cold wall, the other gripping my flashlight. The beam revealed nothing unusual until I reached the halfway point. There, caught in the light, was a small brass plaque I hadn't noticed before. The tarnished surface bore a simple inscription, Vigilance Eternal. Below it, barely visible beneath decades of oxidation, was a symbol that matched the mark on my chest. My fingers traced the emblem unconsciously. The metal was warm to the touch, impossibly, feverishly warm, as if something within the wall itself generated heat. A violent thunderclap shook the lighthouse, so powerful that dust and small fragments of mortar showered down from above. The mark on my chest flared in response, burning with such intensity that I gasped, clutching at my shirt as if I could smother the sensation. "I'm here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was addressing. "I've come back." No response came, yet the burning subsided slightly, as if my acknowledgement had satisfied some requirement. I continued upward, each step feeling increasingly like a processional march towards some inevitable conclusion. The landing below the lantern room appeared unchanged, the logbook still open to its final entry, the dust undisturbed. The final ascent to the lantern room felt different this time, weighted with purpose rather than fear. The amber glow I'd seen previously was absent, the lantern room dark as I emerged into its circular space. The massive Fresnel lens stood silent and cold, its precisely arranged prisms catching and fragmenting my flashlight beam into thousands of tiny rainbows that danced across the curved walls. Through the storm-lashed windows, I could see the raging sea below, waves crashing against the rocks with apocalyptic fury. I circled the lens slowly, drawn to the brass control panel that once regulated the light's operation. Beneath layers of dust and corrosion, I could make out dials, switches, and a manual hand crank, an emergency backup system from an earlier era. My fingers hovered over the mechanisms, uncertain yet compelled. The mark on my chest throbbed in time with the crashing waves below, each pulse more urgent than the last. Outside, lightning split the sky in a blinding display, striking so close that the air inside the lantern room crackled with static electricity. In that momentary illumination, I saw him, Thomas Blackmore, standing on the opposite side of the lens. No longer faceless, he appeared as he must have in life, beard streaked with gray, eyes intense beneath heavy brows, uniform immaculate despite the century and a half that separated us. His hands rested on the brass railing surrounding the lens, knuckles white with strain. When he spoke, his voice seemed to emanate not from his mouth, but from the lighthouse itself, a rumbling vibration that I felt rather than heard. The light must not fail. Another lightning strike, and he was gone, but the impression of his desperate intensity remained. I moved toward the control panel as if sleepwalking, my actions guided by knowledge I didn't consciously possess. My hands found the emergency crank, stiff with disuse but not frozen. I began to turn it, each rotation requiring greater effort than the last. The mechanism groaned in protest, decades of deterioration resisting my efforts. Sweat mingled with rainwater on my brow despite the cold, my muscles burning as I continued to crank. Something inside the lens assembly shifted, a clicking sound followed by the distinctive odor of kerosene. Impossible. The fuel reservoirs would have been drained when the lighthouse was electrified, and again when it was decommissioned. Yet the smell was unmistakable, growing stronger with each turn of the crank. A faint glow began to emanate from within the lens, not the electric brilliance of modern illumination, but the warm, wavering light of flame. It strengthened with each rotation, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Through the glass panes, I could see the storm intensifying to supernatural levels. The sea had risen dramatically, waves now crashing against the base of the lighthouse itself. The structure trembled under the assault, yet I felt no fear, only a growing sense of rightness, a purpose fulfilled. The light within the lens flared suddenly, achieving full brilliance. The Fresnel prisms captured and amplified it, projecting a beam out into the tempest that seemed to physically push back the darkness. As the light reached its full power, the mark on my chest burned white hot, then vanished, the contract fulfilled, the obligation transferred. Beyond the circle of illumination, something moved in the darkness offshore, something vast and ancient that had been waiting for this moment, for this storm, for the light to fail after more than a century of vigilance. I caught only glimpses through gaps in the squalling rain, a suggestion of limbs that weren't quite tentacles nor arms, a mass that displaced water without being of the water itself, eyes that reflected the lighthouse beam like 1,000 shattered mirrors. The thing recoiled from the light, retreating into deeper waters with a subsonic howl that vibrated through the lighthouse's stone foundation. Thomas Blackmore appeared beside me, more solid now, his expression grim but satisfied. "Every 100 years, it rises," he said, his voice clearer now. "Drawn by the souls lost to these waters. Only the light keeps it at bay, not modern electricity, but the old flame. The keeper's flame." "The lighthouse was decommissioned," I whispered. "They said it wasn't needed anymore." Blackmore's laugh was without humor. "They forgot why it was built. Not to guide ships to safety, though it did that too, but to ward off what dwells beyond the continental shelf. To hold back the hunger that grows with each passing decade. But the light is burning now," I said. "It's safe." Blackmore turned to me, his expression solemn. "For tonight. But the storm will pass, and you will leave, and the light will go out again. Unless what? Unless someone tends it. Someone marked. Someone chosen." His eyes bored into mine. "Someone like you." The implications crashed over me like the waves against the rocks below. A lifetime of isolation, of vigilance, of purpose. Before I could respond, a massive wave struck the lighthouse with such force that the entire structure shuddered. Glass shattered in one of the lantern room panes, allowing the full fury of the storm to invade our sanctuary. The flame within the lens wavered dangerously. "Decide," Blackmore said, his form beginning to fade as the light dimmed. "The marking is only the invitation. The choice must be yours." Another wave struck, and through the broken window, I caught a clearer glimpse of what waited in the darkness beyond the light's reach, patient, ancient, hungry. The flame guttered lower. I had to choose. The storm abated shortly before dawn, retreating like a spent adversary. First light revealed a coastline transformed, trees uprooted, boats dashed against rocks, debris scattered across beaches suddenly wider from erosion. The road to Harper's Cove was impassable, communication networks down. It would be days before the outside world could reach Black Rock Lighthouse. Days before anyone would think to check on the historian who had ventured out as the storm approached. In the lantern room, the flame burned steady within the Fresnel lens, its beam a pale ghost against the brightening sky, invisible to most eyes, but still projecting its protective influence over the waters. I sat on the narrow walkway surrounding the lens, watching as the rising sun painted the Atlantic in watercolor washes of pink and gold. The entity that had lurked offshore during the height of the storm had retreated to deeper waters with the light's restoration, but I could sense its continued presence, a psychic weight pressing against the edges of consciousness, testing the boundaries of the light's protection. Thomas Blackmore had vanished with the storm's fury, but evidence of his long vigil remained. In daylight, I could see what darkness had hidden, names etched into the brass railing, dozens of them spanning generations. The keepers he had chosen. The ones who had accepted the mark. My own name was now among them, freshly carved by my hand in the delirious hours after I made my choice. The logbook sat open on my lap, not the official Coast Guard record, but the secret keeper's journal Eleanor had shown me. Somehow it had found its way from the Historical Society to the lighthouse, waiting for me on the gallery landing as if it had never left. I'd spent the night reading the accounts of those who came before me, understanding now the compulsion that had driven them, the responsibility they had accepted, the sacrifice. The final entry before mine was dated 15 years ago, the night of decommissioning. They've extinguished the light for the last time. They don't understand what they've done, what they've awakened. I can't leave my post. I won't. Even if they take away the fuel, the electricity, I'll find a way. The light must never go out. It must never go out. It must never. The writing deteriorated into frantic scrawls after that, the pen apparently tearing through the paper in places. The keeper's fate was unrecorded, but I'd seen it with my own eyes, the headless figure on the stairs, the impossible blood that still pumped from a body long dead. I turned to a blank page and began my own entry, my hand steadier than I would have expected. The storm has passed. The entity has retreated, but not departed. I understand now why Blackmore built this place, why he chose to remain beyond death, why he marks those who can continue his work. The light must never go out. The simple act of writing those words solidified my decision. With each stroke of the pen, I felt the outside world, my career, my connections, my former life, recede like the tide, leaving behind only purpose. Clarity. I closed the journal and rose, stretching muscles stiff from the night's vigil. The mark on my chest had reappeared during the night, no longer burning but permanently etched into my skin, a brand, a badge, a covenant. Practicalities would need to be addressed. The broken window required repair. The kerosene supply was finite. The structure itself had weathered the storm but showed signs of neglect that would worsen without intervention. I would need supplies, tools, books to pass the long nights ahead. Perhaps, in time, I could establish communication with Eleanor and others who understood what dwelt offshore, create a network of awareness, if not active participation in the vigil. But that would come later. For now, there was only the light, the sea, and the knowledge of what waited in the depths. I descended the spiral staircase, each step feeling familiar now rather than foreboding. The headless keeper was gone, the steps clean and dry. The wall tallies remained, however, a record of days, months, years of vigilance by those who came before. At the bottom of the tower, I unbolted the door and stepped outside. Sunrise had fully claimed the sky, pushing back the last remnants of night. The air smelled clean, purged by the storm's fury. My car remained where I parked it, though partially buried by debris and sand. It represented my last connection to the world beyond Blackrock, a world that now seemed distant, almost theoretical compared to the concrete reality of my new purpose. I would drive it into town one last time, gather what I needed, make arrangements for my extended, perhaps permanent, stay. The historians and academics I'd worked with would eventually report me missing. There would be searches, questions, perhaps even a cursory inspection of the lighthouse. But they wouldn't find me, not really. By then, I would have become part of Blackrock itself, another layer of vigilance overlaid on the centuries of watchfulness that preceded me. I turned to look up at the lighthouse tower, stark white against the blue morning sky. From outside, no one would see the flame that still burned within. To passing ships, to casual observers, Blackrock would remain decommissioned. Dark. Abandoned. Only those marked would know the truth. A movement at the lantern room caught my eye, a figure silhouetted against the glass. For a moment, I thought it was Blackmore returned, but as I shielded my eyes against the rising sun, I recognized the shape as my own. Yet I stood on the ground, looking up. The figure above raised a hand in solemn acknowledgement, and I found myself mirroring the gesture. Past and future collapsed in that moment. I was simultaneously the observer below and the watcher above, the newcomer and the eternal guardian. As I lowered my hand, the figure in the lantern room faded, leaving only the glass, the stone, and the invisible flame that must never be allowed to die. The hunger in the deep would rise again. The tide would bring it closer. The storms would give it strength. But the light would be waiting. And so would I. It must never go out. Have you ever felt the weight of silence? Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your eardrums until you're certain something must break it, something must be there, waiting to be heard? My name is Eleanor Webb, and I document abandoned places for my photography blog. 37 years old, twice divorced, with more comfort in empty buildings than crowded rooms, that's me in a nutshell. People call it bravery. I call it selective socializing. The Sunflower Children's Hospice in Lawton, Oklahoma had been on my list for months. Closed 3 years ago due to funding cuts, it stood forgotten at the edge of town, a low-lying brick building partially hidden by overgrown oak trees. The perfect subject. The October wind whispered through yellowing leaves as I approached the building, camera bag heavy against my hip. Something about the place felt different from other abandoned buildings I'd photographed. Most empty structures have a sense of absence, of something that once was but is no longer. This place felt occupied. I found an unlocked service entrance at the back, the door creaking on rusted hinges as I pushed it open. The smell hit me immediately, antiseptic mixed with dust and something else. Something sweet, like bubblegum or children's cough syrup. "Hello?" I called out, more from habit than expectation of an answer. My voice disappeared into the building, swallowed by the darkness. I switched on my flashlight and began documenting the space. The nurse's station. The playroom with faded murals of unicorns and rainbows. The cafeteria with tiny chairs tipped over like casualties of a miniature war. Each room told stories of little lives paused in their most fragile moments. I photographed it all, peeling wallpaper, abandoned medical equipment, handprints and dust. But something kept drawing me deeper into the building, a compulsion I couldn't explain. My ears strained in the silence, catching what seemed like whispers just beyond the range of hearing. The air felt charged, like before a thunderstorm. Is someone there? I called again, my voice sounding smaller now. Had that been a giggle? A soft, childlike laugh from down the corridor? No. Impossible. I turned a corner and found myself facing a long hallway of patient rooms. Something moved at the far end, a shadow? A trick of light? My heart stuttered as I raised my camera. Room 13 stood at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Unlike the others, this door had a small rainbow painted on it, colors muted by years of dust. As I approached, the whispering grew more distinct. Not words exactly, but sounds, like children playing a game where you only mouth the words. I pushed the door open with my fingertips. The room was nearly empty, painted a pale blue that had faded to the color of a winter sky. A small bed. A nightstand. A window with blinds that cast striped shadows across the floor. And in the center of the room, sitting upright in a tiny wooden chair, was a doll. Not the plastic kind with blinking eyes and recorded messages. This was an old-fashioned cloth doll with button eyes and yarn hair, dressed in a faded gingham dress. Its face was hand-stitched with simple features, 2 black button eyes, a nose that was just a small triangle of fabric, and a mouth sewn in red thread. My camera forgotten at my side, I stared at the doll. It seemed too clean, too deliberately placed in this dusty abandoned room. Someone must have been here recently. I raised my camera, focusing on the doll's face. Through my viewfinder, I could have sworn one button eye winked at me. I jerked back, the camera swinging wildly from my neck. Get it together, Eleanor, I whispered to myself, pressing my palms against my eyes. Just a trick of the light through the blinds. Nothing more. But when I looked again, the doll was facing slightly to the left. Hadn't it been facing straight ahead? A cold draft swept through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. The door behind me creaked, swinging gently though there was no breeze inside the building. And then I heard it clearly, a child's sob, breaking the silence like glass shattering on concrete. It came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room before fading into a whimper. My mouth went dry as I backed toward the door, unable to tear my eyes from the doll's stitched face. Who's there? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The doll remained motionless, but something changed in the room. The air grew thick, heavy with an emotion I couldn't name. Grief? Longing? Rage? The blinds began to tap gently against the window glass, though there was no wind. Tap. 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 Like tiny fingers counting out a rhythm. I reached for the doorknob behind me, my fingers trembling. The button eyes of the doll seemed to grow larger, darker, becoming holes that threatened to pull me in. And then, as clear as day, I heard a child's voice whisper, "Stay with me. Please don't leave me alone again." The room temperature plummeted, my breath visible in sudden clouds. The doll's head tilted slightly, impossibly, yarn hair shifting over cloth shoulders. I stumbled backward through the doorway, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of what I just experienced. Imagination. Stress. Old buildings settling. There were 1,000 rational explanations. Yet none of them explained why, as I stood there in the darkened hallway, I could hear the soft sound of a child's laughter coming from inside room 13, or why the rainbow on the door seemed briefly to glow with colors too vivid for this forgotten place. I told myself I would leave. Get in my car and drive away, delete the photos, forget this place existed. Instead, I found myself walking back toward the entrance, thinking about the records room I'd passed earlier. If I was going to document this place, I needed to do it properly. Learn its history. Understand what happened here. Understand who might have left a doll sitting in an empty room, waiting for someone to find it. And why, despite every instinct telling me to run, I felt compelled to return. What draws us back to places that frighten us? Is it the adrenaline, the thrill of confronting our fears, or something deeper, a recognition that some stories demand to be heard? The records room was a jumble of filing cabinets and forgotten paperwork. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I rifled through drawers, looking for anything about room 13 or its occupants. My hands trembled slightly, still unnerved by my experience with the doll. My phone showed no signal inside these walls, not surprising for an old building with thick concrete. The isolation felt suddenly oppressive, as if the hospice itself was cutting me off from the outside world. I pulled open another drawer, fingers sifting through manila folders labeled with names and dates. Most were administrative, budget reports, supply inventories, staff schedules. Nothing about patients or their stories. A soft shuffling sound came from the hallway. Footsteps? Small, light steps like a child's. Hello? I called, my voice cracking slightly. Silence responded, but it wasn't the empty silence of an abandoned building. It was the hell-breath silence of someone listening. I forced myself back to the files, pulling open another drawer. This one contained patient records arranged alphabetically. My moral compass wavered. These were private medical records, after all, but my journalistic curiosity won out. I began scanning the names. Anderson, Timothy. Blackburn, Emily. Cohen, Daniel. And on through the alphabet, each folder containing the brief, tragic story of a child's final days. Some contained photographs, smiling faces in hospital beds, crayon drawings, notes from parents and siblings. As I reached the end of the drawer, a name caught my eye, Williams, Lily. Something about it seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. I pulled the folder, opening it to find a photograph of a girl about 7 years old with curly brown hair and a gap-toothed smile. She wore a gingham dress strikingly similar to the one on the doll in room 13. My blood ran cold. According to the file, Lily Williams had been the last patient at Sunflower Children's Hospice before its closure. She had no living relatives, both parents killed in the same car accident that had left her with terminal injuries. She had spent her final 8 months in room 13 and had died alone on the day the hospice officially closed. The file noted that Lily had been inseparable from a handmade doll given to her by a nurse. Patient expresses concern about being separated from button after death, read one psychological evaluation. Something fell in the hallway outside, a metallic clatter that echoed through the empty building. I jumped, dropping the file as papers scattered across the floor. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice stronger now, fueled by anger at my own fear. Nothing. Just the settling of an old building, I told myself. Yet the air felt charged, expectant. I gathered the papers, returning them to the folder. As I did, something slipped out, a child's drawing. It showed a stick-figure girl holding hands with what appeared to be the doll, standing beside a rainbow. Beneath it, in careful childish printing, me and Button waiting for someone to play with us. The hairs on my neck stood up. I tucked the drawing back into the folder and returned it to the drawer, but kept my phone out to take photos of Lily's records. Evidence. Documentation. The rational scaffolding I needed to support whatever irrational experience I was having. As I raised my phone to capture the first image, the screen went black. Dead battery? Impossible. It had been at 70% just minutes ago. A child's voice whispered directly behind me, "She doesn't like pictures." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through empty air. No one was there, but the temperature had dropped dramatically. My breath fogged in front of my face. "Lily?" I whispered, surprised by my own voice. "Is that you?" The fluorescent light above me flickered once, twice, then glowed weakly, casting sickly blue light over the room. Impossible. The power had been cut years ago. Papers rustled in the filing cabinets. Drawers began to slide open and closed, slowly at first, then faster. Files flew from the cabinets as if thrown by invisible hands, papers swirling around me in a bizarre cyclone. In the center of the whirlwind, a shape began to form, not solid, but denser than the air around it. The silhouette of a small child, translucent and wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. My legs threatened to give way beneath me. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. The papers abruptly dropped to the floor, the light flickered out, and silence fell again. The presence, whatever it had been, was gone. My flashlight beam trembled as I directed it around the now messy room. Among the scattered papers on the floor lay a single crayon, red and worn down to a stub. It rolled across the floor as if pushed by invisible fingers, coming to rest at my feet. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm. Warm, as if recently held by a child's hand. The sudden, intense desire to leave overwhelmed me. I had to get out, get fresh air, regain my grip on reality. I pocketed the crayon and hurried toward the door, stepping over scattered files. As I reached the threshold, I heard a soft voice behind me. "You'll come back, won't you?" Button gets so lonely. I didn't turn around. Didn't answer. Just walked, then ran, through the darkened hallways toward the exit, navigating by memory and the bobbing beam of my flashlight. The service door seemed farther away than I remembered, the corridors longer and more twisted. Had I taken a wrong turn? The building's layout seemed to have changed, rearranging itself to keep me inside. I rounded another corner and froze. There, in the middle of the hallway, sat the doll from room 13, Button. It hadn't been there moments before. Couldn't have been. I approached slowly, flashlight trained on the motionless figure. The stitched mouth seemed different somehow, curved slightly upward at the corners, as if smiling. As I watched, a drop of red appeared at the corner of the doll's sewn mouth, bright against the faded cloth. Then another drop, running down like a tear. Paint? Blood? I couldn't tell. I stepped around the doll, giving it a wide berth. The exit was just ahead now. I could see daylight through the dusty window in the door. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of cloth rustling against the floor. I didn't look back. I ran the final few steps, burst through the door into the fading afternoon light and gulped the fresh air. The golden hour was ending, long shadows stretching across the overgrown parking lot. I'd been inside longer than I'd realized. My car sat where I'd left it, ordinary and reassuring in its solidity. As I fumbled for my keys, I glanced back at the hospice building. In a second-floor window, not room 13, which had been on the first floor, stood a small figure. A child, or what looked like one, watching me. Beside the child, held up against the glass, was Button the doll. I started my car with shaking hands and pulled away, gravel crunching under tires. In my rearview mirror, the hospice receded, becoming smaller but somehow no less present. The rational part of my brain constructed explanations, stress-induced hallucinations, elaborate pranks, wind and shadows creating illusions. But in my pocket, the crayon remained warm against my thigh. And on my camera, when I checked later that evening, the photos of room 13 showed the doll in slightly different positions in each frame, turning, incrementally but unmistakably, to face the camera. To face me. I told myself I wouldn't go back. Couldn't go back. But as I lay in bed that night in my motel room, I heard a child's laughter in my dreams and felt Button eyes watching me through the darkness. And I knew, with the certainty of someone hearing their name called, that Lily and Button were waiting for my return. When did curiosity become obsession? 3 days had passed since my visit to Sunflower Children's Hospice, and I hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Button eyes watching me, heard a child's laughter echoing through empty corridors. I moved from the motel to a small rental cabin outside Lawton, spreading my research across a wooden table. My camera's memory card contained 27 photos of room 13, and in each one, the doll, Button, had moved slightly. Not dramatic movements, but undeniable changes, a tilted head, arms positioned differently, once even appearing to reach toward the camera. I'd spent hours online researching the hospice's history, particularly Lily Williams. Local newspapers had covered the tragic car accident that killed her parents and left her fatally injured. Several articles mentioned the hospice's closure due to budget cuts, forcing the transfer of all patients except Lily, who was too fragile to move. According to the official record, a skeleton staff had remained to care for her until the end. But one blog post from a former nurse hinted at something darker, allegations that in the final days, administrative staff had already moved on, leaving Lily with minimal care. The post had been deleted, but Google's cache preserved fragments. Shameful how they abandoned her. That poor child spent her last hours practically alone, just her and that doll she loved so much. I still hear her sometimes, crying out for someone to stay with her. My phone chimed, a text from my editor asking about my next blog post. I told him I was working on a piece about abandoned healthcare facilities in rural America. I hadn't mentioned the doll, or Lily, or anything that happened in room 13. How could I? He'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I glanced at the red crayon I kept, now sitting beside my laptop. Sometimes, when the cabin was particularly quiet, I could swear it moved slightly, rolling a few millimeters across the wooden surface without any touch. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Nothing more. I made another cup of coffee and returned to my research. The hospice had been built in the 1980s on land previously occupied by a tuberculosis sanatorium. Before that, according to county records, it had been part of a larger property that included an orphanage run by a religious order. Layer upon layer of children's suffering built into the very soil. Outside, thunder rumbled across the Oklahoma sky. A storm was coming, the air heavy with imminent rain. The cabin's windows reflected my tired face back at me, dark circles under my eyes making me look older, haunted. Behind my reflection, for just a moment, I thought I saw a small face peering in, curly hair, wide eyes, a gap-toothed smile. I spun around. Nothing there, of course. My phone rang, startling me. Unknown number. Hello? I answered, voice raspy from too much coffee and too little sleep. Silence on the line, then a sound that might have been breathing. Very faint, very small. Who is this? I demanded. A child's voice, distorted by static. You promised you'd come back. The line went dead. My hand shook as I set the phone down. I hadn't promised anything. Had I? The memory of standing in the records room came back to me, hearing that small voice ask if I'd return. I hadn't answered, had I? Or had some part of me, some unconscious response, formed an agreement I didn't remember making? Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the cabin in stark white light. In that flash, I saw it, sitting on my bed, motionless and impossible, Button the doll. I cried out, stumbling backward against the table, sending papers flying. When the next lightning flash came seconds later, the bed was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Yet even as I tried to convince myself, I knew I had to go back. Not for my blog or for some journalistic integrity, but because something had followed me from that place. Something that wouldn't leave me alone until I returned. Rain began to fall, heavy drops hammering the cabin roof. I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and, after a moment's hesitation, the red crayon. Whatever awaited me at Sunflower Children's Hospice, I would document it. Prove to myself and others that I wasn't losing my mind. The drive back to the hospice was treacherous, rain coming down in sheets that my wipers could barely clear. The road wound through dark countryside, trees looming like sentinels on either side. Twice I nearly missed turns, my headlights catching reflective signs at the last moment. By the time I pulled into the overgrown parking lot, night had fully fallen. The hospice building loomed through the rain, darker than the surrounding darkness. No lights inside, of course, the building had no power. And yet, was that a faint glow from one of the first floor windows? Room 13? Thunder boomed overhead as I stepped from the car, rain immediately soaking through my jacket. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to drive away, to forget this place and the impossible things I'd seen. Instead, I walked toward the service entrance, flashlight cutting a weak path through the darkness. The door swung open at my touch, as if the building had been expecting me. The smell hit me again, antiseptic, dust, and that sweet bubblegum scent, stronger now. Lily? I called, my voice echoing through empty corridors. I came back. Like you wanted. The beam of my flashlight seemed dimmer inside, barely penetrating the darkness that pressed in from all sides. The hallways felt narrower than before, the ceiling lower. The building itself seemed to be contracting around me, pulling me toward its center, toward room 13. I passed the records room, now eerily tidy. The papers that had been scattered across the floor were neatly stacked on a desk, as if someone had spent hours organizing them. The temperature dropped as I approached the patient wing, my breath frosting in front of me. The doors to each room stood open, except for room 13, which remained slightly ajar, just as before. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a small figure darting from one doorway to another. Not the doll this time, but something faster, more fluid. A child. Lily? I called again. I want to talk to you, to understand what happened. A giggle echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by the patter of small feet running across linoleum. I followed the sound, drawn deeper into the building's maze. The rational voice in my head grew fainter with each step, drowned out by a growing certainty that I was approaching some threshold, a boundary between what I had always believed about the world and something else entirely. The hallway to room 13 stretched before me, longer than I remembered. The rainbow on the door seemed to glow faintly, colors pulsing like a heartbeat. As I approached, the door swung open on its own, revealing the pale blue room beyond. The tiny bed, the nightstand, the window with its striped blinds, and in the center, sitting in the wooden chair, Button the doll. But the chair beside it, a second small chair I hadn't noticed before, was also occupied by a little girl with curly brown hair, wearing a faded gingham dress that matched the doll's. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes large and dark. Lily Williams. She looked at me with an expression of curious expectation, as if I was the impossible thing in this scenario, not her. "You came back," she said, her voice the same one I'd heard on the phone, in the records room, in my dreams. Not threatening. Just lonely. Desperately lonely. "Yes," I managed to say, my own voice strange to my ears. "I came back." Lily smiled, revealing the gap where her front teeth should have been. "Button said you would. Button is always right." I stood frozen in the doorway, camera clutched forgotten in my hand. The girl before me wasn't solid. I could see the wall behind her through her form, but she wasn't quite transparent either. She existed in some in-between state, present and not present simultaneously. "What happened to you, Lily?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from her file. Her smile faded. "They left me. Everyone left. Mom and Dad went to heaven, but they couldn't take me yet. The doctors and nurses went away too. Only Button stayed." She patted the doll's cloth head. "But Button can't play games or read stories. Button can just listen." My heart ached for this child, real or imagined, ghost or hallucination. "You were alone when you died," I said softly. Lily nodded. "It was scary. I called and called, but nobody came. Just Button. And then it got dark, and I got sleepy, and when I woke up I was still here, but different." She looked down at her semi-transparent hands. "Nobody can see me now. Except Button. And you." "Why me?" I whispered. "Because you're alone too," she said simply. "Button told me. You understand." The truth of her words struck me like a physical blow. My divorces. My preference for abandoned buildings over crowded rooms. My life spent documenting places others had left behind. "What do you want from me, Lily?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. She slipped from her chair and approached me, movements fluid but slightly wrong, as if gravity affected her differently. "Stay and play with us. Just for a little while." She held out her hand, small and pale and impossibly there. I should have run. Should have turned and fled this haunted place, this impossible child. Instead, I found myself setting down my camera and flashlight and reaching out to take her hand. It was cold, so cold it burned, but solid enough to grasp. Lily's face lit up with joy, and something inside me broke at the sight. How long had this child waited for someone to simply hold her hand? "Come sit," she said, tugging me toward the chairs. "Button wants to tell you a story." As I moved to sit in the child-sized chair, the door to room 13 swung shut behind me with a decisive click. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the window. Inside room 13, time seemed to slow, to stretch, to fold in on itself. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, I began to understand that I might not be leaving this place, at least, not as the same person who had entered. There are moments when the barrier between worlds grows thin, when what we know and what we fear, what is real and what is impossible, blur together like watercolors on wet paper. Room 13 had become such a place for me, a thin place where Lily Williams and her doll Button existed in defiance of death, of time, of everything I had believed about reality. I sat in the tiny chair, knees nearly touching my chest, watching Lily play with Button. She moved the doll around the room, having conversations with it in whispered tones I couldn't quite catch. Occasionally, she would look up at me and smile that gap-toothed smile, as if checking that I was still there, still witnessing her eternal play. My watch had stopped at 11:17, but whether it was AM or PM, I no longer knew. The storm outside continued, but muted now, as if room 13 existed in a bubble separate from the normal flow of time and weather. "Lily," I said softly, "how many others have come here?" "To this room?" She paused her play, considering. "Some. They don't usually stay long. They get scared and run away." Her face clouded. "Button doesn't like it when they run away." "What happens to them?" I asked, my mouth dry. Lily shrugged, the gesture heartbreakingly childlike. "They leave. But they remember us. Sometimes they come back." "And what happens when they come back?" Her eyes met mine, suddenly ancient in her young face. "They stay longer. Sometimes forever." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "Are they here now? The others who stayed?" Lily nodded, pointing to corners of the room that had seemed empty to me. "Mr. Peterson came to take pictures like you. He lives in the East Wing now. And Miss Tompkins came to write a story about the hospice. She reads to us sometimes." I saw them then, or sensed them more than saw, translucent figures huddled in the corners of the room. A man with a camera hanging around his neck. A woman clutching a notebook. Other shapes too, less distinct, as if they had been here longer and had begun to fade even from this half-existence. Horror washed over me, clearing the fog that had settled on my mind since entering the room. I stood abruptly, the tiny chair clattering behind me. "I need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. Lily's face crumpled. "But you just got here. We haven't even played a game yet." "I'm sorry, Lily. I can't stay." I backed toward the door, feeling for the handle behind me. The temperature in the room plummeted. The blinds began to rattle violently against the window. And Lily, sweet, lonely Lily, began to change. Her translucent form darkened, edges blurring like ink in water. Her eyes widened, the pupils expanding until no white remained, just bottomless black circles in her pale face. "And oh," she screamed, her voice no longer a child's, but a chorus of voices, old and young, male and female, all crying out in unison. "You promised." Button the doll rose from the floor where Lily had left it, hovering in midair. The stitched mouth split open, revealing darkness and what looked like tiny, sharp teeth. I fumbled with the door handle, finding it ice cold and immovable. "Please," I begged, "I'll come back again." "I promise. Just not now. Not forever." The other shapes in the room, the ghosts of previous visitors, began to move toward me, their movements jerky like damaged film. Their faces came into focus as they approached, expressions frozen in eternal terror. Lily floated toward me, her feet no longer touching the ground. No one leaves, Button. No one leaves me. Not again. My back pressed against the door, or hammering against my ribs. There was nowhere to run, no escape from this nightmare. The ghosts were almost upon me, their cold presence stealing the breath from my lungs. In desperation, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the red crayon I'd taken from the records room. Lily, I gasped, holding it out, I brought this for you. To draw with. She paused, the darkness around her wavering slightly. Her gaze fixed on the crayon, recognition flickering across her distorted features. My special red, she whispered, her voice momentarily her own again. The nurse took it away. Said I couldn't draw on the walls anymore. It's yours, I said, extending my hand further, the crayon a small splash of color in the increasingly monochrome room. I found it and brought it back for you. Lily drifted closer, her form shifting between the monstrous shadow and the little girl I'd first seen. Button the doll remained suspended in air, Button eyes fixed on me with malevolent intensity. With a sudden movement, Lily snatched the crayon from my hand. The moment her cold fingers touched mine, visions flashed through my mind, Lily alone in this room, crying out for help that never came. The doll beside her, its button eyes reflecting the ceiling as the little girl's breathing slowed, then stopped. The moment when something else entered the room, something that had been waiting for a vessel, for a grief so pure it tore a hole in the barrier between worlds. Button had never been just a doll. The room spun around me as the realization hit, Lily wasn't the one keeping me here. She wasn't the one who had trapped the others. She was as much a prisoner as they were, caught in this endless afterlife by whatever had taken residence in Button. Lily, I whispered, Button isn't your friend. It's using you. Using your loneliness. Her eyes widened, flashing between normal and those terrible black voids. No. Button stayed when everyone else left. Button loves me. The doll rotated slowly in the air, its stitched mouth stretching wider, those tiny teeth gleaming. Whatever's inside Button doesn't love anyone, I said, forcing strength into my voice. It feeds on your pain. On your abandonment. The other ghosts had stopped their advance, hovering uncertainly at the edges of my vision. Were they listening? Understanding? Lily clutched the red crayon to her chest, looking between me and the doll with confusion. Button promised we'd never be alone again. That we'd have friends forever. Look at your friends, Lily, I said, gesturing to the ghostly figures. Are they happy? Are they here by choice? She turned to look at the other trapped souls, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time. Their faces, frozen in expressions of terror and despair, told a story Button had kept hidden from her. They're scared, she whispered, realization dawning. They're prisoners. The doll began to vibrate in the air, Button eyes spinning in their sockets. The stitched mouth opened wider, revealing a darkness that seemed to pull at the light in the room. Lily, I said urgently, you don't need Button anymore. You don't need to be alone. You can move on. Find your parents. The mention of her parents triggered something, a softening in her spectral form, a flicker of the little girl who had lost everything. Mommy and Daddy? She asked, voice small again. But Button said they forgot me. That everyone forgets. No one forgot you, Lily, I said softly. I found your file. People were looking for someone to take care of you. The hospice closing wasn't supposed to leave you alone. It was a terrible mistake, not abandonment. Tears formed in her dark eyes, hovering like liquid diamonds before trailing down her translucent cheeks. I was so scared, she whispered. It hurt, and I called for help, but no one came. I know, I said, my eyes filling. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But trapping yourself here with Button isn't the answer. The doll dropped suddenly to the floor, then began to skitter across the linoleum like a grotesque spider, Button eyes fixed on me with undisguised hatred. Don't listen to her, came a voice from the doll, deep and wrong and ancient. She'll leave you like all the others. Only I stay. Only I remain. Lily looked down at Button with new eyes, seeing not the beloved companion but the malevolent entity wearing the shape of childhood comfort. You're not my friend, she said slowly. You're the one who keeps everyone trapped. Even me. The doll screamed, a sound like metal scraping against metal, and lunged toward Lily, yarn hair bristling like angry snakes. I moved without thinking, throwing myself between the child and the doll. Button collided with my chest, tiny cloth hands clutching at my clothes, those impossible teeth seeking flesh. Cold pain blossomed where it touched me, a bone-deep chill that seemed to reach for my heart. Run, Lily! I gasped, struggling with the surprisingly strong doll. Find the light. Go to your parents. The other ghosts in the room began to move, no longer drifting but actively helping, pulling at Button, trying to free me from its grip. They had been prisoners too long, I realized. They were fighting for their freedom. Lily hovered uncertainly, the red crayon still clutched in her translucent hand. I don't know how, she cried. I don't know where to go. Button snarled, cloth body contorting as it fought against my grip. There is nowhere to go, it hissed. Only here. Only US. Forever. But something was happening in the room. The storm outside had intensified, lightning flashing in rapid succession, illuminating the space in strobing bursts. And in those flashes, the far wall of room 13 seemed to waver, to thin, revealing glimpses of something beyond, a warm golden light unlike anything in this cold, abandoned place. There, I said, pointing with one hand while holding Button at bay with the other. That's your way out, Lily. That's where you're supposed to go. She turned toward the light, her face transforming with wonder. I can hear them, she whispered. Mommy and Daddy. They're calling me. Button shrieked, redoubling its efforts to break free of my grip. The room began to shake, plaster falling from the ceiling, the wooden chair splintering as if under enormous pressure. Go now! I shouted above the cacophony. We'll hold it here. The other ghosts formed a circle around Button and me, their spectral hands helping to contain the thrashing doll. United in purpose after years, perhaps decades, of captivity. Lily moved toward the wavering wall, toward the golden light that seemed to grow stronger with each step she took. She paused at the threshold, looking back at me with those impossible eyes, now clear and bright and beautiful. Thank you, she said, for bringing my crayon, for telling the truth. Then she stepped forward into the light and was gone. The moment she vanished, Button went rigid in my hands, a terrible howl emanating from its stitched mouth. The Button eyes darkened, then cracked down the middle, black liquid seeping out like tears. And oh, it screamed, its voice now singular again, ancient and filled with rage. You cannot take what is mine. The walls of room 13 began to collapse inward, reality itself seeming to fold around us. The other ghosts were fading, their forms growing transparent as whatever had bound them here weakened. Button writhed in my hands, its cloth body growing hot, then scalding. I couldn't hold on, my fingers blistering from the heat. I dropped it to the floor where it continued to thrash, yarn hair igniting with unnatural green flames. The door behind me suddenly gave way, swinging open to reveal the dark corridor beyond. The other ghosts were streaming past me now, heading toward the exit, toward freedom. "Come on," called the ghost I recognized as Mr. Peterson, his camera swinging wildly around his neck. "This place is collapsing." I stumbled backward through the doorway as room 13 imploded, the walls closing in like a book slamming shut. The last thing I saw before the door crashed closed was Button, engulfed in those impossible green flames, its button eyes fixed on me with a hatred that transcended death. Then I was running, the other free ghosts running alongside me through collapsing corridors. The building shook around us, years of decay accelerating in moments, beams crashing down, windows shattering inward. The exit sign glowed ahead, impossibly bright in the darkness. We burst through the service door into the storm-lashed night, rain instantly soaking through my clothes. I turned back just in time to see the hospice building folding in on itself, walls collapsing, roof caving in. Not from structural failure, but as if some central force was pulling everything toward room 13, toward the epicenter of whatever evil had resided there. The free ghosts gathered around me in the parking lot, their forms growing fainter by the second, expressions no longer frozen in terror but shifting toward peace, toward acceptance. "Thank you," whispered Miss Tompkins, her notebook now empty in her spectral hands. "We can go now." One by one, they faded into the storm-dark night, leaving me alone in the rain, watching as the Sunflower Children's Hospice crumbled into ruins. In the final moment before the building completely collapsed, I thought I saw, just for an instant, a small figure standing in the window of room 13, not Lily, but something darker, something ancient and malevolent, watching me with button eyes that promised our story wasn't over. Then it was gone, buried beneath tons of concrete and steel and decades of sorrow. I stood in the rain until dawn broke, bearing witness to the end of Sunflower Children's Hospice and whatever had dwelled within it. When the first rays of sunlight touched the ruins, I returned to my car, soaked and exhausted but somehow lighter, as if a weight I hadn't known I carried had been lifted. As I reached for my car door, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a small drawing done in red crayon, showing a stick-figure girl holding hands with two larger figures. Above them arched a perfect rainbow. I drove away from the ruins of Sunflower Children's Hospice as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind me. In my rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw a small girl with curly hair standing by the road, waving goodbye. But when I looked again, there was nothing there but the Oklahoma wind stirring the tall grass and the road stretching endlessly before me. Is memory a form of haunting? 6 months have passed since the night Sunflower Children's Hospice collapsed in on itself, taking with it the malevolent entity that had resided in Button the doll. 6 months of questioning my sanity, of trying to piece together what was real and what was nightmare. I completed my blog post about abandoned healthcare facilities in rural America, mentioning the hospice only briefly, a footnote about funding cuts and administrative failures. I said nothing about Lily Williams, nothing about Button, nothing about room 13. Who would believe me? The official explanation for the building's collapse was structural failure due to years of neglect, accelerated by the violent storm that night. The local paper ran a small story about it, noting that thankfully no one had been injured. No mention of the bodies they must have found in the rubble, the remains of Mr. Peterson, Miss Tompkins, and the others who had been trapped there. Perhaps there were no bodies to find. Perhaps they had been gone so long that nothing remained but dust. Or perhaps they had truly been freed that night, both from Button's influence and from whatever tethered them to this world. I moved from Oklahoma to Maine, as far from the plains and their buried secrets as I could get. I rented a small cottage on the coast, where the constant sound of waves helped drown out the memories of a child's laughter and the clicking of button eyes in darkness. My photography blog continued, but I found myself drawn to different subjects: lighthouses, fishing boats, living places rather than abandoned ones. Places filled with light and movement and human connection. But the story of Lily and Button didn't end the night the hospice collapsed. It followed me, in ways both subtle and profound. The drawing in red crayon remained on my passenger seat for 3 days after I fled Oklahoma, despite multiple attempts to remove it. Each time I threw it away, it would reappear, not in the same place, but somewhere I would eventually find it, in my camera bag, between the pages of my notebook, tucked into the sun visor of my car. Finally, I stopped trying to discard it. I framed it instead, hanging it in my new cottage as a reminder, though of what, I wasn't entirely sure. That some stories demand to be remembered, perhaps. That some souls need witnesses to their passing. Dreams came often in those first months, dreams of Room 13, of Button eyes watching me from corners, of a little girl's hand cold in mine. I would wake gasping, certain I could smell antiseptic and bubblegum, the cottage walls seeming to contract around me like the hospice on that final night. But the dreams changed over time. Lily appeared less frightened, more at peace. Sometimes she stood in a sunlit meadow, holding hands with 2 adults I presumed were her parents. Sometimes she waved to me from a distance, as if to say she was all right now, that I could stop worrying. Button never appeared in these newer dreams. Whatever had inhabited the doll remained buried in the ruins of Sunflower Children's Hospice, or so I hoped. 3 months after moving to Maine, I began researching the hospice's history in earnest. Not for my blog, but for myself, to understand what had happened there, why that place had become a thin place where the barriers between worlds could be breached. The internet yielded little beyond what I already knew, but through persistent requests and some well-placed donations, I gained access to county archives and historical records not available online. What I found confirmed my suspicions, layer upon layer of suffering built into the very foundations of that place. The tuberculosis sanatorium had indeed preceded the hospice, operating from 1920 until 1952. Records showed an unusually high mortality rate, particularly among children. Several staff members had been dismissed for cruelty and neglect, though details were sparse. Before that, the orphanage operated by the Church of Eternal Salvation, a religious sect with no current presence in Oklahoma, had housed up to 60 children at a time. Health Department reports from 1910 through 1918 documented concerning conditions, overcrowding, inadequate food, harsh discipline. And beneath it all, the land itself had history. According to tribal records I accessed through a local university, the area had been considered cursed by indigenous peoples, a place where the barrier between worlds was dangerously thin, where spirits could cross over and sometimes take possession of the unwary. They had a name for entities like the one that had inhabited Button, Soul Eaters. Creatures that fed on grief and abandonment, that used the pain of the living to anchor themselves to this world. The knowledge should have terrified me. Instead, it brought a strange comfort. I hadn't imagined what happened in Room 13. The haunting had been real as Lily's pain, as real as Button's malevolence, as real as the drawing that still hung on my wall. 4 months after Oklahoma, I received an email from a woman named Jessica Torres, a former nurse at Sunflower Children's Hospice. She had found my blog post and reached out, saying she had information about the facility's final days that might interest me. We arranged to meet at a cafe in Portland. Jessica was in her 50s, with tired eyes and hands that constantly moved, straightening napkins, rearranging sugar packets, nervous energy that never quite dissipated. I was there the last week, she told me, voice low though the cafe was nearly empty. One of the skeleton crew that stayed to care for Lily. There were supposed to be 5 of us, but by the end, it was just me and Dr. Michaels. The others, they couldn't handle it. Handle what? I asked, though I already knew. The doll, she said simply. That damn doll. Lily was so attached to it, wouldn't sleep without it, cried if it wasn't in her direct line of sight. Dr. Michaels wanted to take it away. Said it wasn't healthy. But how do you take away a dying child's only comfort? I nodded, understanding all too well. The night before Lily died, Jessica continued, I came in to check her vitals and found her sitting up in bed, having a conversation with the doll. Not unusual for a child her age, except. She paused, fingers twisting a paper napkin. Except the doll was answering. Not out loud, not so I could hear it, but Lily was responding to things, complex things. Medical things a 7-year-old shouldn't understand. What kinds of things? I asked. Details about her condition. About death. About what happens after. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She told me Button had explained that she would be alone after death unless she took others with her. That everyone leaves eventually, but Button knew how to make them stay. My blood ran cold. What did you do? I took the doll away, Jessica said. Hid it in a supply closet on the other side of the building. Lily was inconsolable, but I couldn't. There was something wrong about that doll. Something in the eyes. What happened then? I went home for the night. Dr. Michaels was supposed to stay, but... She looked down at her shredded napkin. He called me at 2 a.m., said he had a family emergency and had to leave. Asked if I could come in early for my shift. By the time I got there at 4, Lily was gone, and the doll was back in her arms. Silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken horror. I've never told anyone this, Jessica finally continued. Who would believe me? But then your blog post mentioned the hospice, and I had this feeling, this certainty that you knew more than you were saying. I considered how much to reveal, how much this woman could handle. In the end, I told her everything about my visit to the hospice, about Lily's ghost, about Button and the other trapped souls, about the building's collapse. As I spoke, her face shifted from disbelief to recognition to a kind of grim acceptance. I've dreamed about her, Jessica confessed when I finished. Lily. In the dreams, she's always trying to tell me something, but I can never quite hear her. I reached into my bag and pulled out a photograph, a copy of the crayon drawing that had appeared in my car, the one that now hung in my cottage. Is this what she's trying to show you? I asked. Jessica's hand shook as she took the photograph. Where did you get this? Lily gave it to me. After she was free. Tears spilled down Jessica's cheeks. I tried to go back, you know. After I found her body. I thought I should at least arrange for a proper burial, contact services. But I couldn't make myself walk through those doors again. Something kept me out. Fear, I thought at the time, but now I wonder. If it was Button, I finished for her. Keeping you away so it could have Lily to itself. She nodded, returning the photograph. Do you think she's truly free now? At peace? I thought of my changing dreams, of Lily in the sunlit meadow with her parents. Yes, I said, I think she is. We parted ways after that, Jessica returning to her life in Portland, me to my cottage by the sea. We promised to stay in touch, bonded by our shared experience of things most people would never believe. 5 months after Oklahoma, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving downstairs. Not the house settling or the wind in the eaves, but deliberate movement, small footsteps on the wooden floor. Fear paralyzed me for long moments, memories of Button rushing back, the teeth, the eyes, the ancient hatred. Had it somehow followed me here? Found a new vessel? I forced myself out of bed, taking a heavy flashlight as an improvised weapon. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, flashlight beam cutting through darkness. The living room was empty. So was the kitchen. Nothing seemed disturbed, no sign of intrusion. Until I reached the small study where I kept my photography equipment and files. There, on the desk, sat a cloth doll I had never seen before. Not Button, this doll was newer, cleaner, with blue button eyes instead of black, and yellow yarn hair instead of brown. Its stitched mouth formed a simple smile, innocent on the surface. But I knew better now. Knew what could hide behind innocence. I approached slowly, flashlight trained on the motionless figure. "Who sent you?" I whispered, unsure if I expected an answer. The doll remained still, but something caught my attention, a small piece of paper tucked into its cloth hands. With trembling fingers, I removed it and unfolded the note. In a child's careful printing. "Thank you for helping Lily. Others need help too. We are waiting in thin places." Below the message was a crayon drawing of a building I didn't recognize, a Victorian mansion set on a hill, windows like watching eyes. At the bottom of the page was an address in West Virginia. I sank into my desk chair, staring at the doll, at the note, at the illustration of another haunted place where children's souls might be trapped. Part of me wanted to burn the doll, the note, to flee deeper into isolation where these ghosts and their needs couldn't find me. I had done my part, hadn't I? Freed Lily, destroyed Button, survived to tell the tale. But another part, the part that had reached out to take a ghost child's hand in a forgotten room, knew this wasn't over. Some stories choose their witnesses. Some witnesses become champions. Dawn found me at my laptop, researching the address in West Virginia, an abandoned school for troubled children, closed in 1974 after allegations of abuse. Beside my computer sat the new doll with its blue button eyes, watching as I booked a flight, reserved a rental car, began planning my journey to another thin place. 1 week later, I packed my car with camera equipment, research materials, and a small overnight bag. As I prepared to leave my coastal sanctuary, I paused before the framed crayon drawing, Lily with her parents beneath a rainbow. "I'm helping them," I whispered to the empty room. "Like I helped you." The drawing didn't respond, of course. But as I turned to leave, the morning sunlight caught it just so, making the crayon colors glow with renewed vibrancy. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, waves catching the light like scattered diamonds. I breathed in the salt air one last time before sliding into the driver's seat. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement, a small figure with curly hair standing on my porch, raising a hand in farewell. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Just the wind stirring the tall beach grass, and the road stretching endlessly before me. The new doll sat on the passenger seat where Lily's drawing had once appeared, its button eyes reflecting the open road ahead. Whatever waited in West Virginia, whatever thin place needed a witness, whatever souls needed freedom, I was ready. Some hauntings never end. They just change form, becoming purpose instead of fear, mission instead of memory. And sometimes, the things that terrify us most are the things that ultimately save us from ourselves. I started the engine and drove away from the sea, toward mountains and forests and the shadows they contained, leaving only echoes and after-images behind, like photographs slowly developing in a darkroom, revealing truths that had been there all along, waiting for the right light to make them visible. Have you ever looked into the darkness and felt it looking back? The abandoned farmhouse stood against the Tennessee sky like a broken tooth, jagged and out of place among the rolling hills and dense forests. I wasn't supposed to be there. None of us were. But when you're 21 and bored in a small college town, the allure of the forbidden becomes irresistible. There were 5 of us that day: myself, Ethan, Marcus, Lily, and Jen. We heard the stories about the old Harrington property, how the family had disappeared without a trace nearly 40 years ago, how locals claimed to hear whispers coming from the grounds at night, how animals refused to go near the place. But we were rational, educated university students. Ghost stories were for children and the superstitious. "This place is incredible," Ethan whispered as we pushed through the rusted gate. The hinges protested with a long, mournful creak that seemed to echo across the overgrown yard. "Think of the history here." I nodded, but something about the property made my skin prickle. The air felt heavier here, almost viscous, as if it were reluctant to enter my lungs. I told myself it was just the dust and pollen from the neglected landscape, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. "Hey guys, check this out." Marcus called from behind the house. We followed his voice around the weathered structure, our feet crunching through dead leaves and fallen branches. The back of the property was even more overgrown, with wild vines climbing up what remained of a stone wall. At the center of the yard stood an old well, its stone edges crumbling in places, a wooden roof hanging precariously overhead. Classic horror movie setup, Lily laughed, tossing her dark hair over her shoulder. "All we need now is for someone to suggest we split up." "Don't even joke about that," Jen replied, her voice tight. I glanced at her and noticed she was hugging herself, despite the warm spring air. "This place gives me the creeps." I wanted to agree with her, but instead I found myself drawn to the well. It seemed older than everything else on the property, as if the house and other structures had been built around it rather than the other way around. The stones were worn smooth in places, covered in a thin film of moss and lichens that suggested centuries of exposure to the elements. "I wonder if there's still water down there," I mused, approaching the edge. "Be careful," Ethan cautioned, following me. "That structure looks ready to collapse." I leaned forward, peering into the darkness below. The well was deep, far deeper than I'd expected. The sunlight only penetrated a few feet before surrendering to an absolute blackness that seemed to swallow all light. I couldn't even see a reflection of water at the bottom. "Anybody got a flashlight?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the darkness. Marcus pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight feature. "Move over," he said, joining me at the edge. He aimed the beam downward, and we all gathered around to look. At first, we saw nothing but rough stone walls descending into darkness. Then, just as Marcus was about to pull back, the light caught something. A reflection, but not of water. It was too clear, too defined. "Is that—" Lily began, but her voice trailed off. "A face," Jen whispered, finishing the thought that none of us wanted to voice. And it was. At the bottom of the well, where there should have been water or dirt or nothing at all, there was a face looking back at us. but it wasn't a reflection of any of our faces. This was something else entirely, pale, with features that seemed to shift and blur even as we stared at it. The eyes were what struck me most, dark, wide, and filled with an emotion I couldn't name, but that made my heart race with primal fear. "This is some kind of trick," Ethan said, his voice strained with forced rationality. "A projection or something." "From where?" I demanded, gesturing around the abandoned property. "There's no electricity here, no technology." As we argued, I kept my gaze fixed on the face below. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, it changed. The mouth, which had been a neutral line, curved upward at the corners. It was smiling at us. Marcus dropped his phone in shock. We heard it clatter against the stone walls as it fell, the light spinning wildly on its descent, illuminating flashes of the well's interior. And then we heard a splash, much sooner than seemed possible given the depth we'd been seeing. "Oh God," Marcus groaned. "My phone." "Forget the phone," I said, grabbing his arm as he leaned dangerously far over the edge. "We need to leave. Now." "Don't be ridiculous," Lily scoffed, though her voice trembled slightly. It was just some weird reflection, or our minds playing tricks on us in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I stepped back from the well, I noticed something I hadn't before. The ground around it was bare. No weeds, no fallen leaves, no signs of life whatsoever in a perfect circle around the structure. And then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the depths of the well. Not a splash or an echo, but something that made my blood run cold. My name, whispered in a voice that sounded like water flowing over stones. I looked at the others to see if they'd heard it too. Jen's face had gone completely white, and Marcus was backing away from the well. Ethan and Lily exchanged glances, confusion and fear mingling in their expressions. "Did you guys?" I began, but another sound cut me off. A creaking from the old farmhouse behind us, as if someone, or something, had just stepped on one of its ancient floorboards. "We're leaving," Ethan declared, all pretense of academic curiosity gone from his voice. "Right now." None of us argued. As we hurried toward the gate, I couldn't resist glancing back at the well. In the failing light of the afternoon, I could have sworn I saw a pale hand gripping the edge of the stone, fingers too long and too thin to be human. But by the time I blinked, it was gone, and I told myself it had never been there at all. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face looking up at me from the depths of the well, its smile widening in recognition. I told myself it was just my imagination working overtime, that the stories about the Harrington property had primed me to see something supernatural in what was likely just a trick of the light and shadow. But if that was true, why had Marcus dropped his phone? Why had Jen gone so pale? Why had we all fled without discussion, as if driven by the same instinctual fear? At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop. I began searching for information about the Harrington farm, hoping to find some rational explanation for what we'd experienced. Most of what I found was what we already knew. The family had vanished in the 1980s, leaving behind all their possessions. The case had never been solved. There were the usual local legends, tales of hauntings and mysterious lights, but nothing concrete. Then I found something interesting in an archived article from a local historical society. The Harrington farm wasn't the original structure on that land. Before the farmhouse was built in the early 1900s, the property had belonged to a religious group that the article described as reclusive and devoted to unorthodox practices. The only structure they had built was a well, which they claimed access waters of great spiritual significance. My phone buzzed with a text message, startling me so badly I nearly knocked my laptop to the floor. It was from Jen. "You awake?" I typed back, "Can't sleep." "You too?" Her response came immediately, "Keep hearing things. Whispers. Like at the well." A chill ran down my spine. I was about to reply when another text came through, this one from Ethan. "Anyone else having weird dreams?" Within minutes, all 5 of us were texting back and forth. Everyone had experienced something: strange dreams, unexplained noises, a persistent feeling of being watched. But it was Marcus's experience that disturbed me the most. "My phone just showed up," he wrote. "It was on my desk when I got back from dinner. Completely dry." "That's impossible," Lily responded. "We all saw it fall down the well." "I know what I'm looking at," Marcus insisted. "It's my phone. Same case, same crack in the corner of the screen. But there's something else. There are new photos in my gallery that I didn't take." "What photos?" I asked, my fingers trembling as I typed. "Photos of us," Marcus replied. "From below, looking up at the edge of the well." No one responded for almost a minute. "Then Jen, we need to meet. Now." We agreed to meet at an all-night diner near campus. It was 4 a.m. by the time we all arrived, and the place was nearly empty, just a couple of truck drivers at the counter and a tired-looking waitress refilling coffee cups. Marcus showed us his phone. The photos were exactly as he described, 5 images, one of each of us, taken from below as we peered down into the well. But the angles were wrong, somehow. Too wide, too distorted, as if taken through a lens that didn't conform to normal physics. And in each photo, just visible at the edge of the frame, was a pale, blurry shape that might have been a hand, or might have been something else entirely. "This has to be some kind of practical joke," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone found your phone and is messing with us." "Who?" Marcus demanded. "No one knew we were going out there." "And how did they get into my locked apartment to return it?" No one had an answer for that. "There's something else," Jen said quietly. We all turned to look at her. She was the most sensitive of our group, the one most likely to be affected by the atmosphere of a place. "I've been researching that property since we got back. The well is older than the records show. Much older. There are mentions of it in Native American oral histories from this region. They called it the mouth that speaks with borrowed voices." "What does that mean?" Lily asked, her academic skepticism visibly crumbling. "I think," Jen said, looking each of us in the eye, "that whatever's down there can mimic us. Our voices, our faces. To lure people closer." A heavy silence fell over our table. Outside, the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky, but I never felt more surrounded by darkness. "We need to go back," I said suddenly, surprising even myself. "Are you insane?" Ethan hissed. "After all this?" "We need to know what we're dealing with," I insisted. Marcus's phone came back. What else might follow us home? That question hung in the air between us, unanswerable and terrifying. In the end, we agreed to return the next day, in full daylight. Safety in numbers, we told ourselves. We'd bring proper flashlights, cameras, even a rope to measure the true depth of the well. We would approach this scientifically, rationally. We would find an explanation that didn't involve impossible faces and impossible depths. But as I drove home in the gray light of early morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. That some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed again. I spent the day in a haze of exhaustion and dread, trying to distract myself with schoolwork but unable to focus. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. Every creak of the building's old pipes sounded like distant whispers. As evening approached, bringing with it our planned return to the Harrington property, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "I can't make it tonight." Something came up. Before I could reply, another text came through, this one from Lily. "Have to bail on tonight. Not feeling well." Then Ethan, "Can't do tonight. Sorry." And finally Jen, "Something wrong with Marcus. Going to check on him. Don't go to the well alone." I tried calling each of them, but no one answered. With growing unease, I grabbed my keys and headed for Marcus's apartment. As I drove, I couldn't help noticing how the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have in the fading light, how the faces of people on the sidewalk seemed somehow wrong, their features slightly distorted, their smiles too wide. When I reached Marcus's building, I found the front door unlocked. His apartment was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway that seemed to stretch and contract as I walked down it, an optical illusion caused by my tired mind and frayed nerves. I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, harder. "Marcus?" I called. "It's me. Are you in there?" Silence, and then a sound that might have been footsteps, moving not toward the door but away from it. Toward the bathroom, perhaps, or the bedroom at the back of the apartment. I tried the handle. It turned easily in my grip, the door swinging open to reveal Marcus's darkened living room. "Marcus?" I called again, stepping inside despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The apartment was cold, much colder than it should have been even with air conditioning. My breath fogged in front of me as I moved through the space, checking each room. The living room was empty. So was the kitchen. The bathroom door stood ajar, the space beyond dark and silent. Only the bedroom remained, its door closed. As I approached, I noticed something seeping out from underneath it, not light, but darkness, as if the shadow beyond was so dense it was spilling out into the hallway. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. Inside, I knew with absolute certainty I would find Marcus. But I also knew, with equal certainty, that what I found would not truly be him. I turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the light from the hallway behind me. And in that darkness, I saw something move, a pale shape, too tall and too thin, bending over what might have been a bed, might have been a well, might have been something else entirely. It turned toward me, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I knew it was smiling. In that moment, I realized a terrible truth. We hadn't left anything behind at the well. We brought something back with us. I don't remember running from Marcus's apartment. My next clear memory is sitting in my car, hand shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the ignition. My breath came in short, painful gasps, and my heart hammered against my ribs as if trying to escape. What had I seen in that darkness? The rational part of my mind, the part that still clung desperately to a world of natural laws and logical explanations, insisted it was just Marcus, maybe sick or sleepwalking. But I knew better. The thing in that room had been too tall, its proportions all wrong, its movements too fluid and yet too jerky, like something trying to mimic human motion without fully understanding it. After several attempts, I managed to start my car. I needed to find the others, to warn them. I tried calling Jen first, since her last text had mentioned checking on Marcus. No answer. Then Lily. Voicemail. Ethan's phone went straight to voicemail as well. A terrible thought struck me. What if whatever I'd seen in Marcus's apartment wasn't the only one? What if each of us had brought something back, something that wore our faces but wasn't us? I drove to Jen's apartment, my mind racing through increasingly horrifying possibilities. When I arrived, the building was quiet, nothing visibly amiss. I knocked on her door, harder than I intended, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. No answer. Jen? I called out, pressing my ear against the door. It's me. Are you in there? I thought I heard movement inside, a soft shuffling sound, like bare feet on carpeting, moving toward the door. Then silence. Jen, please. Something's wrong with Marcus. I need to talk to you. More silence, and then a voice that was almost, but not quite, Jen's. Go away. I'm not feeling well. The voice was slightly off, the cadence wrong, as if the speaker had learned English from a book rather than from conversation. A chill ran down my spine. I'm not leaving until I see you, I insisted, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. You don't want to see me, the not quite Jen voice responded, closer to the door now. Not like this. Something bumped against the other side of the door, and I stumbled back, nearly falling. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the doorknob begin to turn, slowly, oh so slowly. I ran. Again. Back to my car, fumbling with the keys, peeling out of the parking lot with a screech of tires. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure standing in the entrance of Jen's building, a figure that might have been Jen if Jen were 7 feet tall and bent at unnatural angles. I drove aimlessly for a while, my mind spinning through options. The police? What would I tell them? That my friends had been replaced by doppelgangers from an ancient well? They'd think I was having a psychotic break. Maybe I was. But the images on Marcus's phone had been real. The voice behind Jen's door had been real. The cold in Marcus's apartment had been real. I found myself driving toward the campus, toward the library. If this was happening, there had to be a precedent, some record of similar occurrences. Jen had mentioned Native American legends about the well. There had to be more information somewhere. The library was nearly empty this late in the evening, just a few dedicated students hunched over laptops or searching through stacks. I made my way to the local history section, scanning titles for anything related to the Harrington property or local folklore. As I searched, I became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The library, normally a comforting space of hushed voices and the scent of old books, felt different. Charged, somehow, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The lights seemed dimmer, the shadows between the stacks deeper and more substantial. And I could feel eyes on me, watching from those shadows. I found what I was looking for, a book on local legends compiled by a history professor in the 1970s. I pulled it from the shelf with trembling hands and found a table as far from the shadows as possible. The section on the Harrington property was brief but illuminating. According to the book, the religious group that had owned the land before the Harringtons had been a splinter sect of a larger organization. They believed that certain places in the world were thin points where the barrier between dimensions could be breached. The well, they claimed, was one such point, a doorway to what they called the inverse world, a realm that existed alongside our own but reversed, like a reflection. The book mentioned rituals performed at the well, sacrifices made to entities on the other side. It described how members of the sect would sometimes disappear, only to return changed, speaking of visions and carrying messages from beyond. But the author noted that those who returned often died shortly after, wasting away from mysterious ailments, their bodies sometimes contorting after death into impossible positions. My phone buzzed, startling me so badly I nearly cried out. A text from Ethan. Where are you? Need to talk. I hesitated, then responded, library. Local history section. The reply came immediately, stay there. Coming. I looked back at the book, flipping through pages, scanning for any information that might help us. The sect had been disbanded after a particularly gruesome incident in which multiple members disappeared into the well and never returned. The property was sold, and the new owners, not yet the Harringtons, had attempted to seal the well. But problems persisted. Livestock disappeared or died mysteriously. People reported seeing their own reflections moving independently of them or hearing their own voices calling from empty rooms. Finally, the property was abandoned until the Harringtons purchased it decades later, apparently unaware of its history. They lasted longer than previous owners, nearly 30 years, before their mysterious disappearance. One detail caught my attention. According to local legend, the entities from the inverse world couldn't create anything themselves. They could only mimic, copy, reflect. They needed human creativity, human imagination, human souls to sustain themselves. The well was their means of reaching into our world, of finding new sources to feed upon. A shadow fell across the page. I looked up, expecting to see Ethan. It wasn't Ethan. It looked like him, same height, same build, same clothes I'd seen him wearing earlier that day. But the face was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not monstrous or deformed, but subtly, terribly wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the expressions too deliberate, as if each muscle movement had to be consciously controlled rather than occurring naturally. Found you, it said in Ethan's voice, but with that same unnatural cadence I'd heard in Notjen's voice. We've been looking everywhere. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run. We? Not Ethan smiled, the expression spreading across its face like a stain. All of us. We're so worried about you. Behind not Ethan, I saw more figures approaching through the stacks. Marcus, Lily, Jen, or things wearing their shapes. They moved with that same unnatural fluidity, too smooth and yet too jerky, like puppets controlled by unpracticed hands. What do you want? I whispered, slowly closing the book, my mind racing for an escape route. To take you home, not Ethan said, reaching out a hand that seemed to elongate as it moved toward me. To the well. Where we all belong. I grabbed the heavy book and swung it at Not Ethan's head with all my strength. There was a sound, not the thud of impact against flesh and bone, but a wet, splitting noise, like tearing fabric. Not Ethan's face distorted, the features sliding to one side before snapping back into place. I didn't wait to see more. I ran, knocking over chairs, darting between shelving units, heading for the emergency exit at the back of the library. Behind me, I heard not voices, but sounds, hissing, clicking noises that no human throat could produce. I burst through the emergency exit, setting off alarms that wailed into the night. The campus security office was just across the quad. If I could reach it, find someone, anyone human. A figure stepped out from behind a tree directly in my path. Lily, or something wearing her shape. Its eyes caught the campus lights, reflecting them back with an animal-like shine. I veered left, heading toward the parking lot instead. More figures emerged from shadows, from behind buildings, from perfectly ordinary places where no one should have been hiding. All wearing familiar faces, all moving with that same wrong motion. They were hurting me, I realized with growing horror. Not chasing me, but guiding me, directing my flight. And I was running exactly where they wanted me to go, away from people, away from lights, away from anything that might help me. I changed direction again, sprinting toward the brightly lit student center. Friday night, it would be full of people, witnesses, safety in numbers. I was halfway there when something caught my ankle, sending me sprawling onto the grass. I rolled over to see what had tripped me and found myself staring at a hand emerging from the ground, fingers elongated and pale as roots, clutching my leg. The earth around it bulged and shifted as something pushed its way upward, a face taking shape in the dirt, features forming from soil and grass, a face I recognized from the well. A scream tore from my throat, echoing across the empty quad. I kicked frantically, breaking free of the grasping hand, scrambling to my feet. But I was surrounded now, figures closing in from all sides, wearing the faces of my friends but moving all wrong, their limbs too long, their joints bending in impossible directions. And behind them, more figures, dozens of them, wearing faces I didn't recognize, old faces, young faces, faces from different times and places. I realized with a sick jolt that these were the others, the previous victims, everyone who had ever looked into that well and seen something looking back. All of them coming for me. All of them herding me toward the darkness beyond the campus, toward the woods, toward the old road that led to the Harrington property, toward the well that waited for my return. I don't know how I escaped them. My memories of that night fragment after seeing the face in the earth, breaking apart into disconnected images and sensations, running until my lungs burned, hiding in the hollow trunk of a dead tree while things that weren't human searched around me, wading through a freezing creek to mask my scent or trail or whatever they were following, finally finding my way to a 24-hour gas station, where I huddled in the harsh fluorescent light until dawn, jumping at every shadow and reflection. The attendant must have thought I was on drugs or having a breakdown. Maybe I was. But when morning came, I was still alive, still myself, whatever that meant now. I couldn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't call anyone for help because I had no way of knowing who was still themselves and who had been replaced. The only certainty I had was that I needed to understand what we awakened at the well, and I needed to find a way to stop it. I spent the day moving from one public place to another, coffee shops, department stores, anywhere with people and light. I used public computers to research more about the history of the Harrington property and the religious sect that had first built the well. I found scattered references in academic papers, local histories, and more alarmingly, in psychological case studies of mass delusions and shared psychotic breaks. The pattern was always the same. People would visit the well, and afterward, strange events would follow. People changing, becoming withdrawn, or acting out character. Disappearances. Sometimes, violence. And always, those who survived reported seeing their own reflections behaving independently or hearing their own voices when they weren't speaking. By evening, I had pieced together a theory. As impossible as it seemed, the well wasn't just a physical structure, but a breach, a tear in reality. The entities on the other side, whether supernatural, interdimensional, or something else entirely, couldn't physically cross over into our world, at least not completely. But they could project images, reflections, copies of things they saw. And somehow, they could use those reflections to influence or even replace the originals. The most disturbing account I found was from 1963, when a group of teenagers had visited the well on a dare. Within a week, 3 of them had committed suicide. The 4th, a girl named Eleanor Wright, was committed to a psychiatric hospital after claiming that her friends hadn't killed themselves. They had been killed by things that looked like themselves but weren't. Before she was institutionalized, she had tried to set fire to the Harrington property, screaming that she had to close the door. As night fell, I found myself running out of options. I couldn't keep moving indefinitely. I couldn't seek help without risking exposure to whatever had taken my friends. And I couldn't ignore the growing certainty that the entities from the well were spreading, replacing more people, extending their reach into our world. I had to go back to the well. Not because I was being herded there, but because it was the source. If Eleanor Wright had been right, if the well was a door, then maybe it could be closed. I stole a car. I'm not proud of it, but desperation makes criminals of us all. I drove to a hardware store first, buying rope, a powerful flashlight, gasoline, and road flares. Then I headed for the Harrington property, taking a circuitous route in case I was being followed. Night had fallen completely by the time I reached the rusted gate. The farmhouse loomed against the starry sky, its broken windows like empty eye sockets watching my approach. The air was still and unnaturally quiet, no insects chirping, no night birds calling, no distant traffic sounds. As if the world itself were holding its breath. I left the car at the gate, taking my supplies in a backpack. As I approached the house, I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, watching for movement, for hands reaching up from the earth. Nothing happened. The property seemed deserted, peaceful even in the silver moonlight. I knew better than to trust appearances now. The well stood as we'd left it, its stone edges crumbling, its wooden roof hanging precariously. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight around the clearing, into the shadows beneath the trees, at the darkened windows of the farmhouse. Nothing moved. Nothing watched. But I could feel the attention focused on me, the anticipation, like the air before a lightning strike. I set my backpack down beside the well and began unloading my supplies, laying them out methodically. The rope, the flashlight, the gasoline, the flares. As I worked, I spoke aloud, my voice sounding thin and lonely in the night air. I know you're watching, I said. I know you're listening. I know what you are, what you do. You can't have them. You can't have me. I'm closing the door. No response came, but the air seemed to thicken, to press against my skin like invisible hands. I tied one end of the rope around my waist, the other to a sturdy tree at the edge of the clearing. Then I approached the well, steeling myself for what I had to do. I had to see it, the breach, the door, whatever it was down there that allowed these entities into our world. I had to understand it before I could close it. That meant looking into the well one more time, seeing what lay at the bottom. But this time, I would be prepared. This time, I wouldn't run. I braced myself at the edge of the well, flashlight in hand, and leaned forward, shining the beam into the darkness below. At first, I saw only what I'd expect to see in an old well, rough stone walls descending into darkness, patches of moss, the distant gleam of water far below. But as I watched, the image shifted, like a television screen changing channels. The stone walls remained, but beyond them, I saw something else. A space that shouldn't have been possible, that couldn't exist within the physical constraints of the well. It was like looking into a vast, inverted dome where dimensions obeyed different laws. The space stretched outward instead of downward, expanding into infinity while simultaneously feeling claustrophobic, as if the air itself were pressing in from all sides. And in that impossible space, things moved. Shapes that resembled humans but weren't, elongated, fluid, their features constantly shifting and reforming. They drifted through the strange dimension like swimmers in dark water, occasionally pressing against what seemed to be a barrier, a membrane between their world and ours. Among those shapes, I recognized my friends, or rather, perfect copies of them, suspended in that alien environment, mouths moving in silent screams, eyes wide with terror or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which. And beyond them, countless other figures, some in modern clothes, some in garments from earlier eras, all trapped in that in-between place. As I stared, transfixed by the horror and wonder of it, one of the shapes noticed me. It drifted closer to the barrier, pressing against it, its features resolving into a perfect replica of my own face. It smiled at me, a gesture of such profound wrongness that I nearly dropped the flashlight. "Found you," it whispered, its voice somehow carrying through the barrier, through the air, directly into my mind. "Time to come home." The barrier between worlds bulged outward, stretching like a soap bubble about to burst. A hand, my hand, but not my hand, reached through, elongating impossibly as it extended upward, grasping for me. I stumbled back, nearly falling, the rope around my waist pulling taut. More hands followed the first, dozens of them, pushing through the membrane, reaching upward like pale, starving plants seeking light. This was it, the breach widening, the door opening fully. If those things reached me, reached the surface, there would be no stopping them. They would spread, replace, consume, until nothing human remained in our world. I couldn't let that happen. With shaking hands, I uncapped the gasoline canister and began pouring it into the well, the sharp, chemical scent cutting through the unnatural stillness of the air. The hands recoiled as the liquid splashed over them, the membrane rippling in distress. "Go back," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and determination. "Go back to where you came from. This door is closing." A sound rose from the well, not a human sound, but a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur, a harmonics of rage and hunger. The ground beneath my feet trembled. In the farmhouse, windows shattered. The trees at the edge of the clearing bent as if in a strong wind, though the air remained perfectly still. I struck a road flare, its harsh chemical light casting my shadow long and distorted across the clearing. For a moment, I hesitated. My friends were in there, or copies of them were. By destroying the well, was I destroying them too? But I knew the truth, my real friends were already gone. The things wearing their shapes, walking in our world, weren't them. They were reflections, copies, parasites. The real Ethan, Marcus, Lily, and Jen were either dead or trapped in that inverse world, beyond my help. I had one job now: close the door. Seal the breach. In this, I threw the flare into the well. The gasoline ignited with a whoosh, blue-orange flames racing down the stone walls. The sound that rose from the depths was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a scream that wasn't a scream, a vibration that made blood trickle from my nose and ears, that made the world itself seem to waver and distort around me. The hands reaching from the well twisted and curled like burning paper, blackening, crumbling to ash. The membrane beyond rippled violently, tearing in places, the space behind it collapsing in on itself like a dying star. I should have run then. I should have gotten as far from that place as possible. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away from the spectacle of that other world burning, folding, disappearing into itself. And then I saw them, my friends, the real ones, their faces pressing against the rapidly shrinking membrane, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes met mine, recognized me, pleaded with me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." The ground beneath the well began to crack, fissures radiating outward like a spider's web. The wooden roof collapsed, falling into the flames. The stone walls buckled and shifted, stones tumbling inward. And still I stood there, watching, as the last glimpse of that other world, and my friends trapped within it, vanished into darkness. The well collapsed completely, the earth shuddering one final time before settling into an unnatural stillness. Where the structure had stood was now only a smoking crater. The ground caved in on itself, sealing whatever lay beneath. It was done. The door was closed. I sank to my knees, exhaustion and grief washing over me in waves. I had saved the world, perhaps, but at what cost? My friends were gone, trapped forever in that impossible space between dimensions. And I was alone, with a knowledge no one would ever believe, with memories no one could share. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the devastated clearing in pale gold light, I gathered my remaining supplies and turned to leave. There was nothing more for me here. Nothing but ghosts and ashes. But as I walked toward the gate, a sound made me freeze in my tracks, the soft crunch of footsteps on dead leaves coming from the direction of the farmhouse. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. 5 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me with identical smiles. My friends Ethan, Marcus, Lily, and Jen wore things wearing their shapes. And beside them, a 5th figure. Me. My own face staring back at me with eyes that held no humanity whatsoever. Did you really think it would be that easy? My doppelganger asked, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. You can't close a door from only one side. They began walking toward me, moving in perfect unison, their steps synchronized in a way no humans could manage. I backed away, fear making it hard to breathe, to think. The well was never the only door, the thing with my face continued. It was just the first. Now there are new doors. Better doors. It tapped its chest, my chest, and smiled wider. We are the doors now. 3 months have passed since that night at the Harrington property. 3 months since I faced my own reflection walking toward me, wearing my face like a poorly fitted mask. 3 months of running, hiding, watching the news for signs of what I know is happening but can't prove. I escaped them that morning through sheer luck, a passing truck on the nearby road, a driver who stopped when I ran into the road screaming for help. By the time he pulled over, the 5 figures had vanished, melting into the shadows of the trees as if they'd never been there at all. The driver thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Perhaps I was. He drove me to the nearest hospital, where doctors diagnosed me with acute stress disorder, possibly triggered by the recent disappearances of my friends. Yes, my friends had disappeared, officially missing, their apartments empty, their families frantic with worry. No one connected their disappearances to the abandoned well or the fire that consumed it. I tried to tell the truth, once. The psychiatrist listened patiently, made notes, and increased my medication. I didn't try again. They released me after 2 weeks, once I learned to lie convincingly about my delusions. I didn't go back to campus, didn't reclaim my old life. I couldn't risk running into someone I knew, or something wearing the face of someone I knew. Instead, I withdrew all my savings, bought a used car with cash, and began moving from town to town, never staying more than a few days in any one place. I've been researching, gathering information, seeking patterns. I'm not the first to encounter the entities from the well, and I won't be the last. Throughout history, there have been accounts of doppelgangers, of mirrors that show impossible reflections, of wells and caves and dark waters that serve as thresholds between worlds. What I've learned terrifies me. The entities, I've taken to calling them reflections, though that name hardly captures their true nature, are spreading. slowly, carefully, but inexorably. They replace one person, then use that person's connections to access others. Friends, family, colleagues, an ever-widening circle of infiltration. They're subtle. The replacements can pass for human in most situations, mimicking their originals well enough to avoid detection. But there are tells, if you know what to look for: the slightly unnatural cadence of speech, the too deliberate movements, the way they sometimes forget to blink or breathe when they think no one is watching. And their reflections, their actual reflections in mirrors or glass, sometimes lag by a fraction of a second or move independently in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. I've started documenting cases I believe are connected to the reflections. Individuals whose behavior changed dramatically after visiting certain locations. People who went missing only to return with subtle differences that friends and family can't quite articulate. Clusters of strange deaths or disappearances centered around specific points: wells, deep lakes, abandoned mines. Doors between worlds. I don't know how many of them are out there now. Dozens? Hundreds? Thousands? They could be anywhere, anyone. The barista who holds eye contact a moment too long. The professor whose lectures have taken a strange turn toward existential questions of identity. The child who no longer remembers her favorite bedtime story. Sometimes I see my own face on strangers in crowds, just for an instant before they turn away. A glimpse in a shop window, a flash in the rearview mirror. My doppelganger is hunting me. I'm certain of it. It wants to complete what began at the well, to eliminate the original and take my place completely. I wonder sometimes if I'm truly the original. If the real me is entrapped in that inverse world while I, a copy who believes itself to be real, walk free in this one. How would I know? The reflections believe themselves to be human, to be real, until something triggers the memory of their true nature. Last week, I met someone who I believe is like me, a survivor, a witness to the reflections. Her name is Mia, and she found me through an obscure online forum where I've been documenting my research under a pseudonym. She recognized the patterns I identified because she'd seen them herself, after an experience at an abandoned quarry in West Virginia that had filled with unnaturally still, black water. They're not just copying us, she told me as we sat in a 24-hour diner, speaking in whispers despite the empty restaurant. They're studying us. Learning. Evolving. For what purpose? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Replacement, she said simply. Complete replacement. They want our world because theirs is dying. They need our creativity, our emotions, our souls to sustain themselves. They're parasites, feeding on what makes us human. We've been working together since then, pooling our knowledge, seeking others who might have encountered the reflections and survived. We're trying to find a way to fight back, to close the remaining doors between worlds, to identify and neutralize the copies already among us. It's dangerous work. Twice now, we've narrowly escaped what we believe were reflections hunting us, individuals who showed up in places they had no reason to be, who asked too many questions about our research, whose movements were just slightly wrong in ways that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Yesterday, Mia didn't arrive at our meeting point. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. Her motel room is empty, the bed unslept in. I fear the worst, but I can't stop now. Her notes mention another potential door between worlds, an old lighthouse on the coast of Maine where the keeper disappeared in 1972 after reporting his own reflection moving independently in the lens. I'm heading there tomorrow. I don't know what I'll find, but I know I can't turn back. Too many doors are open now, too many reflections walk among us. Someone has to try to stop them, to warn others, to find a way to close the breaches between worlds. If you're reading this, it means one of two things: either I've succeeded in my mission and can finally share the truth, or I've failed and been replaced, in which case these words are my last testament, a warning to those who might yet be saved. Look closely at those around you. Watch for the subtle wrongness, the moments when humanity slips and something else shows through. Don't trust your reflection if it hesitates, if it smiles when you do not. And whatever you do, don't peer into dark, still waters, don't look down abandoned wells or into the depths of caves or mines. Don't seek the doors between worlds. Because something is looking back. Something that wears your face. Something that wants to be you. And it's getting closer every day. I have to end this account now. I think someone is watching my motel from the parking lot. A familiar figure, standing too still beside a lamppost. I've seen it 3 times now, each time closer to my room. It's wearing my face. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.